Hey everyone, and welcome back. This is one of a series of videos introducing key concepts and issues in American politics. In this video, we're going to consider the question of tribal sovereignty in the context of the federal system of government in the United States. It's a really interesting issue, so let's get to it. When the U.S. was founded, the vast majority of North America remained firmly under the control of indigenous peoples who had lived there for centuries. The federal government recognized the tribes as sovereign and independent nations, with agreements between them, however precarious, encompassed under treaties. We see this status reflected in the U.S. Constitution. Article 3, Section 2, Clause 3 provides that representatives to the House and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, excluding Indians not taxed. Similarly, Article 1, Section 8 provides that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Both of these suggest that the tribal nations were in a unique category, separate and autonomous from the federal government, the states, and from foreign nations. As the United States government negotiated and reneged on treaties with tribes, and as settlers pushed west, Native Americans were pushed off their indigenous lands and onto reservations. Even at the founding of the United States as a country, Native American tribes controlled the vast majority of North America. This map, created by Claudio Sant, a professor of history at University of Georgia, shows that process over time. Beginning in the late 1700s and extending over a century, we gradually see Native Americans push off their homelands, represented in blue, and small reservations, represented in red, established. If you visit the map's website, which I'll link to in the description below, you can see the details on which Native nation lived in a given area and the date of the treaty or executive order that was used by the federal government to establish control over that area. The process by which the U.S. government dispossessed Native Americans of their land and forced them onto reservations is a complex and devastating story spanning centuries of history. The earliest periods saw European settlers arriving in North America in the 16th and 17th century, claiming land for their respective countries and disregarding the rights of indigenous people who already lived there. Driven by various factors, including a desire for resources, religious and political motivations, and the pursuit of wealth and power, European powers, including Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands, all sought to establish colonies in the New World. Their efforts often involved violence, coercion, and exploitation. One example of this process is the colonization of what is now known as Virginia by English settlers in the early 17th century. The Virginia Company of London was chartered in 1606 by King James I to establish a colony in the region, and the first permanent English settlement was established at Jamestown in 1607. The first settlers quickly clashed with the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful indigenous nation that controlled the region. In 1622, the Confederation launched a major attack on English settlements, killing hundreds of colonists. In response, the English launched a brutal counterattack, killing thousands of indigenous people and seizing their lands. This process of violence and dispossession continued for decades as the English gradually expanded their control over the region. Throughout the 19th century, the U.S. government negotiated treaties with various indigenous nations, often promising them land and resources in exchange for ceding their ancestral territories. Such treaties were often used as tools to take indigenous land and resources with little regards for the sovereignty and self-determination of the indigenous nations. And even after they were negotiated, the government frequently failed to uphold its promises, and indigenous peoples were gradually forced onto reservations, which were often small and inadequate for their needs. Treaty negotiations were often conducted in a manner that favored the U.S. government and disregarded the interests and perspectives of indigenous peoples. U.S. negotiators frequently relied on intimidation, deception, or bribery to secure the cession of indigenous lands. Even when treaties were signed, the U.S. government frequently failed to uphold its promises, violating treaty provisions and disregarding the rights of indigenous peoples. For example, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 promised the Sioux people exclusive use and occupation of the Black Hills in perpetuity. However, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills in the 1870s, the U.S. government seized the land in violation of the treaty. Further, as a result of language barriers, cultural differences, and the complex legal and political context of the treaties, many indigenous peoples did not fully understand the implications of the treaties that they were forced to sign. This often led to misunderstandings and disputes over treaty provisions. For example, the 1830 Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, signed between the Choctaw Nation and the United States, included this provision. Article 3. The country hereby ceded and relinquished by the Choctaw Nation shall be taken possession by the United States as soon as the necessary arrangements can be made for that purpose, and shall be protected from the intrusion of all other tribes and individuals whatsoever. And the said Choctaw Nation shall remove to the country assigned to them herein, as soon as the President of the United States shall think proper, and in such a manner as he shall direct, under the superintendence of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, or other such person as he may appoint. This clause outlines the process of land cession and the removal of the Choctaw Nation with several legal terms and concepts. For example, the clause refers to the country hereby ceded and relinquished, which refers to the lands of the Choctaw Nation which refers to the lands that the Choctaw Nation is giving up to the United States. The clause also refers to the need of the United States to take possession of the land to protect it from the intrusion of all other tribes and individuals whatsoever, indicating the legal concept of ownership and sovereignty. It's a complicated legalistic passage common to such treaties that's difficult to comprehend even for native English speakers. Nevertheless, as a result of these treaties, indigenous peoples were often forced to cede their land to colonizers, and in many cases, indigenous nations faced the threat of military force or starvation if they did not agree to cede their lands. One of the most dramatic examples of this process was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which provided the legal pretext for the forced removal of indigenous peoples, authorizing the U.S. government to negotiate treaties with indigenous nations for the dispossession of their lands. The act was controversial and opposed by many, including some members of Congress, who saw it as a violation of indigenous sovereignty and human rights. However, President Andrew Jackson, who was a strong advocate for Indian removal, pushed the act through Congress and signed it into law. The government then used the threat of the Indian Removal Act to compel tribes to sign treaties ceding their land to the United States. One of the clearest examples of this was the process of the Treaty of New Echota. One of several treaties negotiated under the Indian Removal Act, the Treaty of New Echota was controversial within the Cherokee Nation. The treaty was signed by a small faction of Cherokee leaders who did not represent the majority of the Cherokee people, for whom the treaty was seen as a violation of Cherokee sovereignty and rights. Opponents of the treaty appealed to the Senate, lodging a petition signed by more than 15,000 Cherokee tribal members, some 99% of the tribe, but their objections went unanswered and the Senate ratified the treaty. Under the terms of the treaty, the Cherokee were forced to cede all lands in the southeastern United States in exchange for reservation land in present-day Oklahoma. It was also used to justify the forced removal of an estimated 100,000 indigenous people of the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations from their ancestral homelands to the Oklahoma Reservation, a journey known today as the Trail of Tears. Members of the Cherokee and other nations were forced to march more than 1,000 miles to the reservation, with thousands dying of disease, exposure, exhaustion, and murder along the way. The process of forcing Native Americans off their land and onto reservation territories proceeded rapidly through the 19th century, and the breakup of native lands through the allotment in the 19th century and the termination of the 1950s and 60s resulted in a patchwork of federally recognized Native nations across the United States. Today, there are some 326 reservations comprising some 89,000 square miles or 230,000 square kilometers, or about 2.5% of the total landmass of the United States. The smallest of these, at less than 1.5 acres, is the Likely Rancheria in Northern California, which is the cemetery of the Pitt River tribe. The largest is the Navajo Nation, spanning northeastern Arizona and spreading into parts of Utah and New Mexico as well. The Navajo Nation is home to more than 173,000 people and comprises more than 27,000 square miles. The scope and scale of tribal governments widely varies, though. The Navajo Nation is often pointed to as one of the strongest. At its capital, in Window Rock, the Navajo Nation has a system of government that has the same 3 branches of government as the U.S. government does: an executive branch in the form of a tribal president and vice president, a legislative branch in the form of a tribal council, and a judicial branch in the form of a tribal court. The Navajo Nation also has its own bureaucracy, with a number of services provided through the Office of Community Development, the Telecommunications and Utility Agency, the Veterans Affairs Central Administration, the Navajo Housing Authority, the Division of Public Safety, the Window Rock Police Department, the Fish and Wildlife Department, and many others. But it's also home to an office of the U.S. Postal Service, an airport administered and regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration, and an office of the Arizona Department of Motor Vehicles. This patchwork highlights the complexity of tribal sovereignty and the status of reservations in the U.S. federal system. The relationship between the U.S. government and the indigenous nations is complicated by the federal government's official terminology that describes tribal nations as domestic dependent nations. That description originated in the 1831 Supreme Court decision of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, one of the three cases that comprises the so-called Marshall Trilogy. Named for then Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court John Marshall, those three cases provided the foundation of federal Indian law, including the broad contours of tribal sovereignty, so they're worth exploring here in a bit more detail. The first of these cases was Johnson v. McIntosh of 1823. This case involved a dispute over the land ownership between two individuals, William McIntosh and the descendants of Thomas Johnson, who had competing claims to title to the same tract of land in present-day Illinois. Johnson claimed to have purchased the land from members of the Piankenshaw tribe, while McIntosh claimed to have acquired the land from the federal government through a land grant. In its decision, the court held that Johnson's claim to the land was invalid because only the federal government, not private individuals, had the right to acquire and manage land that belonged to Native American tribes. Writing the unanimous opinion, Chief Justice John Marshall set out several of the key principles that would shape the legal framework for Native American land rights and federal tribal relations for decades to come. First, Johnson held that Native American tribes had only a right of occupancy to their land rather than full ownership or title. This claim was rooted in the idea of the doctrine of discovery, under which European colonial powers laid claim or sovereignty over the land they discovered. Under this doctrine, the discovering power had claimed the exclusive right to occupy the land of indigenous groups. According to Marshall, when the United States gained its independence from Britain, it inherited the right of preemption over Native American lands. The legal result of this sleight of hand was that the only way that title could be created over native lands was when they were sold to the federal government. In other words, only the federal government had the power to acquire and dispose of Native American lands, either through treaties or through conquest. Second, Marshall held that only the federal government had the authority to negotiate with Native American tribes for the sale or cession of their lands. Private individuals could not purchase land directly from Native American tribes because such transactions were not recognized by federal law. And finally, Marshall held that the federal government had the duty to protect Native American tribes from encroachment by private individuals and state governments. The federal government's responsibility to protect Native American land rights and sovereignty was derived from the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which gives power to the U.S. Congress to regulate commerce with tribes, among others. The second case of the Marshall Trilogy was Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. This case centered on a dispute between the Cherokee Nation and the state of Georgia over the Cherokees' sovereignty and land rights. At issue was the question of whether the Cherokee Nation was a foreign nation or a domestic dependent nation subject to the authority of the federal government. Georgia had passed a series of laws that asserted its authority over the Cherokee Nation, including the right to extinguish the tribe's land rights within the state's borders. The Cherokee Nation was seeking an injunction against the state of Georgia's new laws. It argued that it was a sovereign and independent nation with the right to self-governance and control over its lands. The tribe had established its own constitution and government and had adopted laws and institutions that were similar to those of the United States. Because of this, the Cherokee Nation maintained that it should not be subject to the jurisdiction of the state of Georgia. For its part, Georgia argued that the Cherokee Nation was not a sovereign nation, but rather a dependent community within the state's borders. As such, Georgia maintained that it was within its rights to pass laws governing the reservation, including removing the tribe from lands in the state. In its decision, the Supreme Court held that the Cherokee Nation was not a foreign nation, but was rather a domestic dependent nation subject to the authority of the federal government, like a ward to its guardian. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the majority opinion, which held that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political entity with its own rights and interests, but also that it was subject to the authority of the United States. However, the court also held that it did not have jurisdiction to hear the case because the Cherokee Nation was not a foreign nation. Therefore, the court dismissed the case for lack of jurisdiction. The decision in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia was significant because it recognized the sovereignty of Native American tribes as distinct political entities with their own rights and interests. However, the court's dismissal of the case also left the Cherokee Nation without any legal remedy to protect its land rights and sovereignty from encroachment by state governments, thereby setting the stage for future legal battles over Native American land rights and self-determination. Less than a year later, the third and final case in the Marshall Trilogy was heard. That case, Worcester v. Georgia, centered on a dispute between the state of Georgia and a non-Native American missionary, Samuel Worcester, who had been arrested for living on Cherokee land without a state license. Worcester argued that Georgia's laws did not apply on Cherokee land because the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign political entity with its own laws and institutions. He also argued that Georgia's effort to assert jurisdiction over to the Cherokee Nation violated the U.S. Constitution and treaties between the federal government and the tribe. In its decision, the Supreme Court held that Georgia's laws did not apply to the Cherokee land and that the federal government had sole authority to regulate relations with Native American tribes. Again, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the majority opinion, which held that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political entity with the right to self-governance and control over its lands. The court held that the federal government has the power to regulate relations with Native American tribes, and that Georgia's efforts to assert jurisdiction over the Cherokee Nation violated the Constitution's Supremacy Clause. The court also held that Worcester was protected under federal law as an agent of the federal government and therefore could not be prosecuted by Georgia for living on Cherokee land without a state license. While the Worcester decision recognized the sovereignty of Native American tribes, it also reasserted the power of the federal government's exclusive authority to regulate relations with the tribes, essentially reaffirming the tribes' second-class status in the eyes of the courts. Together, the three cases of the Marshall Trilogy recognized the power of the federal government to acquire and dispose of Native American lands, while also recognizing the sovereignty of Native American tribes as distinct political entities. The trilogy established that only the federal government had the authority to negotiate with Native American tribes for the sale or cession of their lands, and that private individuals could not purchase land directly from Native American tribes. The trilogy also recognized the right of Native American tribes to self-governance and control over their lands while placing them under the authority of the federal government. It established the principle of federal supremacy in relations between the federal government and Native American tribes and set the stage for future legal battles over Native American land rights and self-determination. And interestingly, they also pit Chief Justice John Marshall against President Andrew Jackson, who wanted to force the removal of Native American tribes from their territory more quickly. While Marshall's decisions limited the scope of tribal sovereignty, they also envisioned, at least in theory, certain legal obligations on the part of the federal government to the tribes. Jackson, on the other hand, rejected the idea of indigenous sovereignty altogether, arguing in favor of forced removal and dispossession of Native peoples from their lands, a policy in direct opposition to the Marshall Trilogy framework. As a result, following the court's decision in the Cherokee Nation case, Jackson famously asserted, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." While the Marshall Trilogy set the stage or the foundation for tribal relations with the federal and state governments, the scope of tribal sovereignty has continued to evolve since then. And while it would take an entire course to fully analyze this, we can highlight some of the key developments since Marshall. These include a variety of Supreme Court decisions and legislative acts. With respect to criminal and legal jurisdiction, the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. v. Kagama that Congress had the authority to regulate criminal offenses committed by Native Americans on tribal lands. Specifically, the court held that the federal government's trust responsibility towards tribes justified its intervention in such matters. This decision expanded the federal government's role in tribal affairs and undermined the scope of tribal sovereignty. Perhaps even more dramatically, in Oliphant v. Suquamish Indian Tribe, the court ruled that tribal governments do not have inherent authority to exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Native Americans on tribal lands. This decision limited the scope of tribal sovereignty by restricting the ability of tribes to prosecute non-Native individuals for crimes committed on tribal lands, further complicating the relationship between tribal, state, and federal governments in matters of law enforcement. More broadly, the passage of Public Law 280 in 1953 granted certain states the authority to exercise jurisdiction over criminal and civil matters on tribal lands. This law significantly limited tribal sovereignty by allowing state governments to interfere in tribal affairs, creating tensions between tribes and states over the appropriate balance of power. Not surprisingly, Public Law 280 has been controversial, with some arguing that it erodes tribal sovereignty, while others contending that it's necessary to address issues such as law enforcement and public safety on tribal lands. In the area of tribal autonomy, the landmark case of California versus Cabazon Band of Mission Indians held that states do not have the authority to regulate gaming on tribal lands if the state allows such gaming elsewhere within its borders. The court's decision affirmed the right of tribes to engage in gaming as an exercise of their sovereign authority, which paved the way for the passage of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988, in which Congress recognizes the rights of tribes to operate gaming facilities as an exercise of their sovereign powers. But the act also requires tribes to negotiate compacts with state governments to address issues such as regulation and revenue sharing. The IGRA has had a significant impact on tribal economies, leading to sharp increases in the number of tribal casinos across the United States. In the broader context, it's important to remember the historical policies intended to destroy Native cultural, religious, and linguistic autonomy enacted as parts of policies throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries that sought to integrate Native peoples into broader societies, policies often described as acts of genocide by Native leaders. The widespread use of boarding schools in both the United States and Canada resulted in the forcible removal of Native children from their families and communities. An estimated 1/3 of all Native American children during this period were forced into boarding schools, sometimes thousands of miles away from their families and communities, where they were forced to cut their hair, speak only in English, and abandon their cultural and religious practices. Indeed, the primary goal of these schools was to assimilate Native children into mainstream American society by suppressing their native languages, cultures, and traditions. Discipline at such boarding schools was often incredibly violent, and in recent years, mass graveyards have been discovered at some boarding schools in Canada and the United States, highlighting the death and destruction that accompanied them. The General Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act of 1887, aimed to break up communal land ownership among indigenous peoples and encourage individual land ownership instead. Under this act, Native Americans were allocated parcels of land, but to receive the full benefits of U.S. citizenship, they were required to abandon their tribal affiliations, cultures, and languages. This policy undermined Native identity by disrupting the intergenerational transmission of language and culture that occurred within tribal communities. The termination and relocation policies of the mid-20th century sought to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream American society. These policies often involve the forced relocation of indigenous peoples from their reservations to urban areas. The disruption caused by these policies, along with the loss of land and community connections, further contributed to the erosion of Native cultures and languages. In 1975, in an effort to begin to undo some of the damage caused by these policies, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. This act aimed to promote tribal self-governance by allowing tribes to assume greater control over federal programs and services provided to them. The act authorized tribes to enter into contracts with the federal government to administer programs related to healthcare, education, law enforcement, and other areas. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act has been an important milestone in the evolution of tribal sovereignty, and it's provided tribes with increased autonomy and decision-making power over their own affairs. But it's also important to remember that Native Americans were not actually even considered U.S. citizens until passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Also known as the Snyder Act, the Indian Citizenship Act granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans born within the territorial limits of the United States, making them citizens of both their respective tribes and the United States. This was necessary because the courts had previously ruled that the 14th Amendment did not apply to Native Americans. And even after passage of the Snyder Act, many states continued to limit Native voting rights, asserting that they were not citizens of the state in which they lived, and therefore not entitled to vote there. It was not until passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which eliminated discriminatory voting practices such as literacy tests and other obstacles that disproportionately affected minority groups, including Native Americans, that Native Americans were granted full U.S. citizenship rights. Native tribes have been actively asserting and defending their sovereignty and autonomy in the context of American federalism. Specifically, we can identify a variety of measures intended to exercise and promote sovereignty both historically and in the contemporary era, using a variety of legal, political, and economic strategies. Think about the historical treaties of Native American tribes negotiated with the U.S. government to establish their rights and protect their lands, resources, and way of life. An example of which might include the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868, which granted the Great Sioux Nation the exclusive use of the Black Hills and other lands of South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. Although this and other treaties were broken or not fully honored by the U.S. government, they remain important legal instruments for asserting tribal rights and protecting tribal sovereignty. More recently, Native American tribes have pursued state-to-state relations as a way of asserting their sovereignty and protecting their rights and advancing their interests. As sovereign nations, tribes have the inherent authority to engage in government-to-government relations with other entities, including state and local governments. By engaging in these relationships, tribes can address issues, resolve disputes, and foster cooperation in areas of mutual concern. This can include strategies like negotiating compacts, which are legally binding contracts with state governments that address specific issues like gaming or taxation. Tribes have also entered into intergovernmental agreements with state and local governments to coordinate efforts and collaborate on various projects and initiatives. These agreements can cover a wide range of issues, including education, healthcare, transportation, and emergency management. For instance, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation in Wyoming State have entered into such agreements with local governments to jointly manage natural resources like fisheries and forestry, and to collaborate on public safety initiatives like law enforcement and emergency response. Finally, subtribes have also sought to influence state-level policymaking by actively participating in the state legislative processes, advisory committees, and task forces. This involvement allows tribes to have a voice in shaping public policy and regulations that affect their communities and assert their interest in the decision-making process. Many tribes have established their own governing institutions to exercise self-determination and manage their tribal affairs. Tribal governments typically include executive, legislative, and judicial branches that enact and enforce laws, regulate business, and resolve disputes. The Navajo Nation, which we touched on earlier, is an example of this and has a comprehensive government structure that includes all three branches of government as well as a well-functioning bureaucracy which runs the day-to-day affairs of the tribe. The independent legal systems and tribal courts established by many tribes to enforce their laws, resolve disputes, and protect tribal rights is another avenue through which tribes maintain their sovereignty. Examples might include the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, which operates a tribal court that handles civil and criminal matters, as well as a separate court that deals with traditional Choctaw customs and practices. Economic development is also an essential aspect of tribal sovereignty, as it allows tribes to generate revenue, create jobs, and improve living conditions for their members. Many tribes have had successful businesses in various industries such as gaming, tourism, agriculture, and industry. The Seminole Tribe of Florida, for example, has built a successful gaming and hospitality empire that includes the Hard Rock International brand, which has significantly boosted the tribe's economic independence and strengthened its sovereignty. Tribes have also protected their sovereignty by challenging adverse government actions and policies in courts. They've used litigation to assert their rights, defend their lands, and seek compensation for past injustices. For example, the Oneida Indian Nation has successfully sued the state of New York in the landmark case Oneida Indian Nation versus County of Oneida to recover ancestral lands that had been illegally acquired. And finally, some tribes have even engaged in diplomatic outreach, pursuing state-to-state and engaging in bilateral and multilateral diplomatic efforts through international organizations like the United Nations. This type of engagement can help tribes build international support for their rights and interests, as well as facilitate trade, investment, and cultural exchanges. Each of these examples demonstrate how Native American tribes have exercised and protected their sovereignty by using a range of strategies that includes legal action, political advocacy, and economic development, which have in turn helped strengthen tribal self-governance and asserted their unique rights and status of tribes within the American political system. Despite the recognition of tribal sovereignty, conflicts can arise between tribal governments and state governments over issues of taxation, land use, and the regulation of businesses on tribal lands. In some cases, state governments have sought to assert their authority over tribal matters, leading to disputes about the appropriate balance of power between states, tribes, and the federal government. In matters involving tribal sovereignty, the federal government often plays a crucial role in mediating conflicts between tribes and state governments, in theory ensuring that tribal rights are protected. In practice, however, it's often fallen far short of this goal. Nevertheless, these conflicts highlight the complexities of federalism in the context of tribal sovereignty, as they involve questions about the appropriate division of power and authority between the various levels of government. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, everyone, and see you in the next video.